The night sky stretched endless above and below Captain Mara Vance as her jet tore through the frozen darkness at 30,000 feet. The horizon a thin silver line beneath a blanket of stars. The hum of the engines a steady reminder that she was alive and in motion, the kind of motion that gave her both freedom and danger. In equal measure, she had flown this route dozens of times before over hostile territory, where the rules of engagement were blurred and survival was never guaranteed. But tonight felt different. The air felt heavier, the silence more fragile, like the pause before a storm. She adjusted her grip on the stick, her gloved fingers flexing as her eyes swept the empty black ahead, and then the cockpit erupted in a sharp, shrill warning, the radar lock tone screaming through her headset so loud she almost flinched. It was the sound every pilot dreaded, the one that told her someone out there had her in their sights, and the kill sequence had begun. Her mind did not need to ask how or why, it already knew the truth. There were enemy fighters in the air, invisible to the naked eye, but close enough to strike. She tried to ignore the sudden weight in her chest, focusing instead on the controls banking hard to the left as her eyes flicked to the threat display. But the lock stayed solid, pulsing red with each tone, like the heartbeat of some predator pacing outside her door. She scanned the sky but saw nothing, just empty shadows swallowing the moonlight. She knew better than to trust the silence, because silence in the sky was a lie. The missiles could already be on their way. The training drilled into her since the first day at the academy took over her mind, slowing her breathing to a steady rhythm. Keeping her hands calm on the controls, each movement measured, precise, deliberate, her instructors had always said the best pilots survived, not because they were faster, but because they were calmer, and in this moment, calm was her only weapon. She pulled into a climb, pushing higher into the thin, cold air. But the lock stayed, the warning tone unrelenting in her ears. She thought of the pilots who had been in this position before and never made it back home. She had read their names in the after action reports, seen their photographs in the halls of the base, faces frozen in time, forever linked to the last moment they had faced this same sound. Some never saw the flash of the missile. Some saw it only for a second before their world turned into flame. She wondered if this was how they had felt, the sharp awareness of life and death, hovering so close they could almost touch it. Her breath fogged the inside of her mask, the heat of her body clashing with the freezing air outside. She could feel the hum of the jet vibrating through the seat into her bones like a second heartbeat. The enemy was out there. She knew it. They had chosen their target, and she was it. Her mind raced through the possibilities. She could dive, break the lock, and run for friendly airspace, but it was too far. She could climb higher, but the thin air would steal her maneuvering. She could turn into the threat head-on, but without visual, she would be throwing herself blind into a knife fight. Somewhere in that cold, black sky, there were eyes watching her hands, ready to unleash fire, and she realized with a strange clarity that this was not just a mission. This was a duel between predators, and only one would see the sunrise. She checked her instruments. Again, the lock still solid, unwavering, and it was in that steady red glare that a thought began to stir in the back of her mind. A memory she had buried years ago of a name she had once carried into battle, a name that had made her enemies hesitate before pulling the trigger, but that was not for now. Now there was only the sound of the engines, the scream of the radar lock, and the vast, empty night waiting to see which one of them would make the first move. The warning tone drilled into her skull like a relentless alarm, refusing to let her think of anything else, and Captain Mara Vance knew every second she wasted brought her closer to the point of no return. She pulled the stick sharply, banking into a wide arc, the G-force pressing her hard into the seat. Her vision narrowing for a moment as she fought to keep the turn smooth she had flown through. Storms dodged surface fire, skimmed mountaintops at speeds that could tear a wing from the fuselage. But this was different. This was the quiet, calculated hunt of another pilot, someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was willing to wait for the perfect kill shot. She rolled out of the turn, checking the display again, but the lock stayed, steady solid. Like it was welded to her. The enemy was matching her moves, adjusting every shift she made as if they could see her. Every thought. Before she acted, she felt a tightness crawl up her spine, the uncomfortable awareness that she was being studied, judged, measured for the moment when the trigger would be pulled. She banked again, this time into a steep dive, the horizon spinning as the altimeter dropped in rapid numbers, the airspeed climbing dangerously fast, her jet slicing through the thin upper atmosphere toward the thicker turbulent layers below. The warning tone stayed. The lock never faltered. They were still on her like a shadow stitched to her every move. She leveled out low enough for the turbulence to start tossing the jet, but not so low that she risked ground fire. She pushed the throttle to its limit, the engines screaming as the air roared past. But the tone continued, mocking her efforts. She imagined the enemy pilot watching her on their radar, smiling as they kept her in their sights, knowing she was running out of ideas and altitude. Her fingers flexed on the controls, sweat beginning to prick at her temples beneath the helmet. She was not afraid, not yet, but the edge of fear was there, creeping in. At the corners of her focus, fear could get a pilot killed faster than any missile. She steadied her breathing, forcing it slow, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She replayed her training in her mind, the countless hours in simulators dodging missile locks, executing maneuvers until her muscles knew them better than her thoughts. But this lock was unshakable. She thought briefly about breaking away toward friendly territory, but the map in her mind told her it was too far. The nearest safe zone was still minutes away, and minutes could be an eternity. When a missile could close the gap in seconds, she considered climbing again, using altitude to bleed off a missile's energy, but the risk of stalling in this thin, cold air was too great. And she could not afford to lose speed. Speed was survival. Speed was life. Another idea flickered at the edge of her mind, a risk so great it would either save her or finish her before she could even react. She could turn into them head-on. Force A. Merge a close-range engagement where skill mattered more than radar locks. But without visual contact, she would be gambling on instinct, and instinct alone in the dark. Even a second of hesitation could be fatal. Her eyes scanned the horizon for any sign, any shimmer of metal in the moonlight, but the enemy remained hidden, ghosts in the vast sky. The lock tone was beginning to feel personal, like a taunt, like a predator, whispering that they had all the time in the world and she had none. She could almost hear them breathing on the other side of the airwaves, patient, disciplined, cruel. Her jaw tightened as she realized they were waiting for her to make a mistake. The kind of mistake that comes when the pressure is too much, when the human inside the machine starts to break. She would not give them that satisfaction. She refused to be the easy kill. She refused to be another name carved into the memorial wall back at base. And yet as the seconds dragged on, she felt something else beneath. The fear and the pressure, a memory surfacing from years ago. A memory of a name that had once been more dangerous than any weapon she could carry, a call sign that had traveled across battlefields. Like a rumor, like a curse she had sworn never to use it again, but the idea was there now, forming like the first spark in dry grass. She did not know if it would save her, but she knew she might not have another choice. The memory of that name sat in her mind like a hidden blade waiting to be drawn, and Captain Mara Vance felt the weight of it pressing against her thoughts. The cockpit was filled with the sound of the engines and the steady predatory tone of the radar lock, yet beneath that noise, her mind drifted back to a different time, a different war, where the name Ghost Viper had been forged in fire and steel. It had been a mission deep over hostile territory, much like this one, except the odds had been worse. Back then. She had been outnumbered 6-1, and she had not only survived, she had destroyed every jet that came for her without taking a single hit. The battle had turned into a legend among pilots, and her call sign had become more than a name. It had become a warning. But legends fade and time erases fear. She had not used that name in years, choosing instead to bury it along with the memories of that night. She had taken her victories quietly, flown her missions, and let new pilots carry their own reputations into the air, and yet here she was with the sound of that tone in her ears, the feeling of unseen eyes locked on her every move, and the understanding that maybe the only way out was to let that ghost back into the world. Her hand hovered near the comm switch, the small plastic button that could carry her voice across the open air into the ears of whoever was hunting her. She pictured them sitting in their cockpits, eyes flicking between their radar display, and the dark sky waiting for her to make the wrong move. They were confident, certain she was just another target lined up in their sights, and it was that certainty she wanted to shatter. She wanted them to hear the name and remember the stories, whispered in flight briefings and mess halls, the stories of the pilot who never lost. She took a long, slow breath, feeling the mask press against her face as the oxygen filled her lungs. She let her heart beat steady into a rhythm matching the hum of the engines. The cold night air shimmered beyond the glass. The moon, a pale silver blade in the distance. Her thoughts sharpened until there was nothing left but the decision before her. Speak the name, or let the hunt continue until they decided it was over. She knew that hesitation could kill, but so could speaking too soon if they were not the kind who knew the stories. Then the name would mean nothing, and she would be exactly where she was now, seconds away from destruction. Her eyes traced the displays again, noting every reading, every flicker of movement on the scopes. The lock stayed firm, unwavering, as if daring her to try something bold. She thought of her old wingmen, the ones who had been there the night Ghost Viper was born. She could see their faces, hear their voices, as they laughed after the battle, not from joy but from disbelief that they were still alive. Some of those voices were gone now, lost to time and war, but the name had lived on in whispers carried by those who had seen it with their own eyes. The tone in her headset seemed to grow louder, as if impatient for her to act. She imagined the enemy pilots on the other side of that lock leaning forward slightly, listening for any transmission from their prey. They would not be expecting her to speak. They would be expecting her to run or to die, and the thought of taking that expectation and breaking it filled her with a cold resolve. She was not a rookie, and she was not afraid to play the one card she still had. Her thumb settled gently against the comm switch, but she did not press it yet. She let her gaze sweep the sky one more time, searching for the faintest sign of movement. Nothing but darkness and the thin whisper of clouds she could feel. The engines rumbling through the frame of the jet like a living heartbeat beneath her. She told herself she would give it 5 more seconds. 5 more seconds to decide whether to stay silent or to let Ghost Viper return to the air. 5 seconds, in which the balance between life and death hung on a choice she had thought she would never have to make again. The seconds stretched into an eternity as Captain Mara Vance kept her thumb against the comm switch, feeling the small clicker beneath her glove like a trigger she had not yet pulled. The radar lock tone still shrieked in her ears, steady, unbroken. Relentless as the breath of the hunters on her trail, her eyes scanned the black expanse outside the canopy, the moonlight spilling in thin silver lines across the glass. Every shadow could be a wing. Every glint could be the nose of an enemy missile. She could feel the weight of their presence, even if she could not see them, and in that weight, she felt the familiar stillness that came before making a move that could not be undone. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, not to rest, but to summon the memory of the moment years ago when Ghost Viper had been spoken into the airwaves for the first time. She remembered the chaos of that battle, the voices shouting over the comms, the heat of the fight pressing against her until all that remained was instinct and skill. She remembered the way the enemy had broken the moment they realized who was on their tail, the way their tight formation had splintered like glass under pressure. She had been younger, then hungrier then, and now she wondered if the name still carried that same edge. The decision came without warning, like a snap in the mind that told her there was no more time for thought. She pressed the comm switch, feeling the small resistance under her thumb give way. Her voice steady, calm, devoid of fear, filled the channel. 2 words carried on a tone as cold as the night around her ghost viper. The name cut through the static like a blade slicing clean through wire, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold itself still. The radar lock tone continued for another beat, and then it faltered, breaking for just a fraction of a second before returning. But in that fraction, she felt the shift like a change in wind direction. Her eyes flicked to the display, searching for any sign of movement. The enemy still held position, but the air around her felt different. She spoke again, this time slower, each syllable deliberate. "This is Ghost Viper." The words not shouted but delivered with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick alive, charged with the weight of recognition somewhere on the other end of the comms in cockpits. She could not see pilots were hearing the name and thinking back to every briefing, every whispered warning, every time an instructor had told them, "If you ever hear this call sign, you do not test it." The radar tone wavered again, almost imperceptibly, but enough for her to know it was not just a glitch. It was hesitation. Hesitation from the kind of pilots who had not hesitated once since this hunt began. And hesitation in the sky was the first crack in the armor. She let her breathing stay. Even her hands loose on the controls, ready for anything whether they came at her now with everything they had, or whether they chose to vanish into the dark. Her mind ran through the possibilities. The stories about Ghost Viper had spread far during her early career. Not because she had chased them, but because her enemies had the ones who had lived to tell the tale had carried those words back to their squadrons, their commanders, their students. She had never needed to embellish the truth. The truth had been enough, and that truth was now echoing in the ears of whoever was hunting her. The seconds ticked by, her instruments glowed against the black. Her jet steady in the air, her body still tuned for a fight. She waited to see if the next sound would be the tone of a missile lock returning with renewed fury or the faint roar of engines turning away from the kill. What she heard instead was something rarer than victory in combat. She heard nothing at all. The silence hung in the air like a frozen wave, suspended in place, refusing to break. Captain Mara Vance kept her hands steady on the controls. The faint hum of the engines, the only sound she could truly trust in this moment. The radar display still glowed with its familiar green wash, but the lock tone was gone. Gone in a way that felt deliberate, as if a hand had been lifted from a trigger just inches from firing. She knew enough about aerial combat to understand that hesitation in the middle of a hunt was not normal. Not unless something had shifted deep inside the mind of the one holding the shot. She scanned the dark for any glimmer of movement, any shadow that did not belong, but the enemy jets remained invisible. Their presence more felt than seen, the kind of presence a predator has when it is close enough to strike, but chooses instead to circle and watch. Her breathing stayed, even her heart still hammering but in a controlled rhythm as if she had been here 1,000 times. Before her mind was already working through the implications, the name Ghost Viper had reached them, and now they were deciding what it meant to them. The air seemed to grow heavier around her, as if the very sky was leaning in to listen to the outcome of this unspoken conversation between hunter and prey. Only now the roles were less clear. She had seen it before in war, the moment when an enemy realizes the target is not what they thought it was, when they start calculating not whether they can win, but whether they can survive. She wondered if that was the calculation happening now inside those unseen cockpits. Her thumb hovered near the comm switch again, but she did not press it. She had already spoken enough, and words in the wrong moment could make the hesitant strike. She chose instead to let the silence work. Let the name settle into the minds of her pursuers like a cold truth that could not be ignored. She pictured them exchanging glances in their cockpits, hearing the static, and knowing the weight behind it. Stories of missions gone wrong when Ghost Viper was involved, whispers of engagements that started with confidence and ended in wreckage and fire. The seconds crawled by slower than any combat she had ever flown, and yet she refused to move too soon in the air. Patience could be as much a weapon as speed. A pilot who could wait out the other could own the fight. She thought back to that night years ago when she had done exactly that, turning the patience of her enemies against them one by one until none were left in the sky with her. She remembered the fear in their maneuvers, the sudden clumsy desperation that came when their certainty dissolved. She wondered if she would see that again tonight. Then, without warning, the faintest blip flickered on her scope. A movement not toward her, but away, slow at first, as if testing her reaction. She kept her jet steady, no sudden turns, no aggressive climb. She wanted them to keep going, to believe that the distance between them was safety. Another blip followed, then another. Her eyes narrowing as she tracked them on the scope, the enemy formation breaking in perfect coordination, pulling away from her airspace, their engines just barely audible in the thin air. She did not chase. She did not taunt. She simply watched them vanish into the black horizon, knowing that whatever had stopped them tonight was not mercy. It was recognition, and recognition could be just as powerful as fear. The lock tone never returned. The blips grew smaller until they were gone, and she was alone again with the cold and the stars. For a long moment, she sat there, letting the silence settle deep into her bones, feeling the tension bleed from her muscles. But not all of it. Some of it remained a reminder that legends could save you once. But they also put a mark on your back, a mark that never faded. She had spoken Ghost Viper into the night, and somewhere beyond the horizon, pilots were still hearing it and making their own decisions about what they would do if they ever found her again. The air inside the cockpit felt different now, not because the temperature had changed, but because the pressure of the hunt had lifted, leaving behind an echo of the tension that had held her in its grip. Captain Mara Vance kept her eyes on the horizon, but her mind replayed every moment since the first shriek of the radar lock, the way her muscles had coiled tight, ready for the fight, the way her breath had slowed, the instant she had decided to speak her old call sign. She knew there had been no guarantee it would work tonight. Yet the hesitation it created had been enough to turn the tide. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that what had happened was not luck, and it was not fear. It was recognition, pure and simple. Recognition of a name spoken in airspace long before tonight, a name that had lived on in briefings and whispered warnings. The knowledge of what that name represented was enough to stop trained killers from pulling the trigger, and that was something few pilots could ever claim yet. The same thing that had saved her could now bring an entirely new storm down upon her. She adjusted her altitude, the controls smooth under her hands, the hum of the engines, a low, steady rhythm in her ears ahead. The faint glow of the horizon promised the safety of friendly skies. But she knew that promise was only for the moment. War had taught her that safety was never permanent. It was only borrowed, and the cost of borrowing it had to be paid sooner or later. She wondered who would be the one to collect that debt and how they would come for her when they did. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the enemy pilots who had turned away. She could picture them breaking formation in perfect silence, pulling back into the darkness with the same precision they had shown while hunting her. She imagined the conversation in their cockpits, the short clipped words between them as they made the decision to disengage. Perhaps there was an argument. Perhaps there was only quiet agreement. She would never know for certain. But she understood one thing. They had not turned away because they could not win. They had turned away because they had measured the risk and decided it was not worth the cost. She respected that choice, even if it had been made against her, because it spoke to the same instinct that had kept her alive through so many battles. Survival came first. Pride came second. and the ones who reversed that order never lasted long. She had seen cocky, young pilots push beyond reason chasing glory and die in the process. She had also seen seasoned veterans walk away from winnable fights because they understood that the sky would always offer another chance, another duel, another test. The dark stretched. Out beneath her in endless folds of shadow, broken only by the silver of moonlight on the cloud tops, she kept her jet level, resisting the urge to push the throttle harder. She was in no hurry now, not after the stillness that had fallen once the enemy had gone. Her eyes scanned the instruments, the readings, steady the air calm, but her body still carried the tension of the chase like a muscle that refused to unclench, even after the danger had passed. She knew that tension was a gift, as much as it was a burden. It kept her sharp. It kept her alive. Her old call sign hung in her mind like a flare still burning in the dark. She had spoken it into the night, and it had reached the ears it needed to reach. She could feel the weight of that moment in her chest, a mixture of relief and inevitability, because once a name like that resurfaced, it was impossible to bury again. She could hide her face. She could fly under different missions, but the name would travel faster than she could. The next time she was on a mission, she could almost guarantee that someone somewhere in the opposing airspace would be listening for it. The border of friendly territory was now just minutes ahead, the static of home frequencies beginning to bleed into her headset. She kept her eyes forward but allowed herself one last scan of the darkness behind her. The sky was empty. The hunt was over. Yet she could not shake the feeling that this had been only the first act of something larger, a test perhaps, to see if the legend still carried weight, and if it did, then others would follow others who might not hesitate at the sound of her voice. She eased the throttle back, the engines softening their roar as the ground lights began to faintly glimmer. Far below her chest, lifted with a slow, steady breath, the kind that comes not from peace, but from surviving another day in the kind of world where survival itself was a victory. And in that breath she accepted the truth. She was no longer just Captain Mara Vance, she was Ghost Viper again. And that would change everything. The faint lights of friendly airspace shimmered far ahead, like distant beacons calling her home. Captain Mara Vance kept her jet on a steady course. Her hands relaxed on the controls, but her mind still locked in the rhythm of combat. Every movement, precise every glance, deliberate. She had flown countless missions before. But tonight felt different. It was not just another survival. It was the rebirth of something she had long buried, and that knowledge carried both a weight and a warning. The comms crackled faintly as she neared the edge of Allied radar coverage. A voice from the operations center calling out her tail number, confirming her position and status. She answered with calm efficiency, her voice betraying none of what had just unfolded in the cold black miles behind her. She did not mention the lock. She did not mention the hunters. She did not mention the two words that had shifted the night in her favor, because some stories were better carried in silence until the moment they were needed again. Below her, the darkness of the land rolled away into faint patterns of light towns and roads, scattered like constellations across the earth. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle drop in tension that came with crossing into skies she knew were guarded by her own. Yet even here she understood that safety was a temporary illusion, the kind that could be stripped away in seconds should the enemy decide to test the border again. Her mind returned to the moment she had spoken the call sign Ghost Viper. It had been like pulling a weapon she had sworn never to draw again, and now that it was out there, she knew it would move faster than she could across channels. She could not hear into briefings. She would never attend the enemy pilots from tonight, would carry it home with them, and their commanders would listen and measure its meaning against the stories they had already heard. Some would dismiss it as rumor. Others would file it away as fact either way. The result would be the same. Her name would once again live in the minds of those who flew these skies. The runway lights of her base were now visible, a sharp line of white cutting through the dark. She began her descent, the engines responding with a smooth drop in pitch, the ground drawing closer. With each second, her body relaxed into the routine of landing the checklist running through her head without conscious thought. But beneath the calm, there was still that hum of awareness that she had stepped back into a role she had once left behind, the role of the hunter, the role of the name that made others hesitate. She touched down with the smooth precision of a pilot who had landed in every condition imaginable, the tires meeting the tarmac with a soft shudder, the engines winding down as she guided the jet toward its bay ground crew, moving toward her with the usual speed and efficiency. Yet she could see a question in some of their faces, the question they would not ask out. Loud, but was already forming somewhere in the chain of command. They would know something had happened out there, something that was not in the mission briefing and was not in the official report. As she powered down, the cockpit lights dimmed, the hum of the jet fading into the background. She sat for a moment longer inside the canopy, hands resting lightly on the controls, looking out into the night. Beyond the base lights, somewhere out there over the horizon, were the pilots who had turned away, and somewhere further still were others who might not. She knew this was not the end of it. Not by a long margin. Climbing down from the cockpit, she felt the cool night air against her face, the sounds of the base familiar and grounding, yet her mind was already elsewhere, mapping out the possibilities of what came next. The legend of Ghost Viper had just been given new life, and legends had a way of attracting both respect and challenge. She did not fear either. She simply understood that. From this point forward, every time she took to the sky, there would be eyes searching for her and ears listening for the call sign that could turn the tide of a fight. As she walked toward the debriefing room, she glanced once more toward the dark edge of the airfield, the place where the night sky began, and she knew that sooner or later it would call to her again, and when it did, she would answer not as Captain Mara Vance, but as Ghost Viper.